Hey everyone, I hope you guys are doing all right. Ben has been treating you guys okay. As you can tell, I have a special little guest right here. My little guest lecturer here, Selena, so she'll be joining us today. All right, we're going to be going over the free responses here, FRQs 1 and 2. So hopefully you guys can do well, and maybe she can do them afterwards, or, we'll see. All right, so taking a look at FRQs 1 and 2. All right, so FRQ 1 is what's referred to as a concept application question. Basically, they're going to give you a scenario and ask you how the government should respond or in what capacities they can respond. So there's always what they call the three actions. So in FRQs 1, 2, and 3, you'll notice that there's action questions. Essentially, parts A, B, and C. So if you remember from APUSH last year, this isn't all too unfamiliar. So in looking at FRQ1 again, there's three actions that you need to answer. The first of which is usually describing something very basic in the scenario, and then the second and third actions is where things get a bit more complicated. So in taking a look at this, let's go ahead and see what one of these questions looks like. All right, so in this question, every day more than 115 people in the United States die after overdosing on opioids. The misuse of and addiction to opioids, including prescriptive pain relievers, heroin, and synthetic opioids such as fentanyl, is a serious national crisis that affects public health as well as social and economic welfare. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that the total economic burden, of the prescription opioid misuse alone in the United States is $78.5 billion a year, including the cost of healthcare, lost productivity, addiction treatment, and criminal justice involvement. These stats coming from the National Institute on Drug Abuse of March 2018. So as we see in the question here, after reading the scenario, respond to A, B, and C below. Part A, describe a power Congress could use to address the issues outlined in the scenario. Part B, in the context of the scenario, explain how the use of congressional power described in Part A can be affected by interaction with special interest groups. And Part C, in the context of the scenario, explain how the interaction between Congress and special interest groups can be affected by the media. So they're asking a couple of things here. So in Part A, just simply asking what is it that Congress could do? As with most times with these questions, what we'll do is we'll go over the sample responses here in a moment. Now, if you don't know right off the bat, like what the answers to these questions would be, don't worry. This would come with knowledge more so in the later part of the year after we've gone over special interest groups. But you can probably guess what Part A would be, as we know what our Congress does. So let's take a look and see what the College Board is looking for in these answers. So, what a good response should include. So, A, describe a political institution, behavior, or process connected with the scenario. And for that, you get a point. And Part B, explain how the response in Part A affects or is affected by the political process, government entity, or citizen behavior related to the scenario. And then lastly, for Part C, explain how the scenario relates to a political institution, behavior, or process in the course. So, in looking at these answers, okay, obviously Selena's already gotten bored and has fallen asleep. All right, but let's take a look at what the sample response would be. As you'll notice here, it is bolded because it's a PowerPoint, but notice that when you are responding, you should label each of your answers A, B, and C to the part that you're responding. Now, the one thing that you'll notice about this response, it's kind of verbose. This is me writing out in as much detail as possible. And you should focus here on the highlighted part, as that is what answers the question. So for Part A, it is within the power of Congress to pass legislation restricting the way opioids are prescribed and with the power of the purse, appropriate more money for opioid education and addiction treatment. Okay, we just put Selena to bed. You can tell she was kind of tired, so we'll go ahead and finish here. All right. So in part A, I answer that one, the power that Congress will be using will be that of passing a law. As Congress is our legislature, it seems kind of common sense that the Congress could pass a law in order to deal with the issue. Other things could include, as I mentioned there, use their power of the purse. They could pass a law about regulating. They could pass a power. They can pass more funding for educational programs and the like. For more treatment, they can do a whole slew of other things. But the one thing that you can't put for Part A is you can't just say Congress can pass a law. You have to say Congress can pass a law to do X, okay? Otherwise, you will not get the point. So you need to describe not only that, yes, Congress is passing a law, but what action are they exactly taking? Now, taking a look here at Part B. Now, again, do you need to be as verbose? No, but you do need to describe your answers correctly here. So, as I mentioned here in Part B, unfortunately, these effects may run into challenges. For example, special interest groups representing the pharmaceutical companies that make the opioids tend to be large donors to officials' campaigns and to have a sizable number of well-connected lobbyists pressing the agendas of the pharmaceutical companies in Congress. These special interests develop long-term relationships known as iron triangles with elected officials, as well as employees of federal agencies that help carry out laws that try to balance the public interest with the demands of lobbyists and the corporations that they represent, and the re-election possibilities of officials. The re-election of officials requires both campaign contributions and the support of the public, so officials try to balance out those needs in a reasonable way. So what I've done in this answer is describe that the relationship of special interest groups, how it affects congressmen, and then obviously how that can then affect how congressmen then do their jobs in relation to these issues. And I know some of these concepts seem like a bit difficult, and it's like, how am I going to do this? Remember, we haven't gone over these yet. This is merely a sample one, and I just kind of wanted to show you how we're going about these answers. So, as we look in Part C, if the balance tends to tip too much in the favor of the drug companies and the expertise of public safety, or rather at the expense of public safety, the media can play a role to tip the balance back of the other direction. Among the many roles that the media play is that of watchdog, keeping a close eye on government practices and investigating areas of concern, and then bringing these matters out in public, where people can then see for themselves what is taking place. An investigative report exposing the corruption could be the catalyst for legal action and genuine change in policy, as it was in the days of the muckrakers in the progressive era, when worker and consumer protections were put in place. Excuse me. So, what I've done in Part C is explain what role the media has and how that could then have an influence on the relationship that I talked about in Part B. All right, so the way that College Board scores this, it's right or wrong. So if you put what they're looking for, or what I will tell you from experience is that sometimes readers, they'll look for certain keywords like, oh, they're talking about this. That sounds like they know what they're talking about. Give them the point. So, for example, as you see in Part B, I mentioned a couple of key terms. So I brought up things like the iron triangle, because that's one of those terms that kind of goes around and is used frequently, one that we'll define later, but it's one that kind of shows your knowledge and content area, and as such, they're more likely then to give you the points. So the best way to answer this is answer completely. Make sure that you're looking at what the question is asking you, and make sure that you complete each of those tasks. Now, lastly here, we're going to go over FRQ2, which is the quantitative analysis question. This one I feel that you have the best opportunity to earn points because it's quite simple. Well, at least for parts of it, and you'll see what I mean as we look at the sample question here. All right, so taking a look here at FRQ2, use the information graphic on the next page to answer the questions. So we see here this data chart here titled Differences Between Republicans and Democrats on Why People Are Rich or Poor. So this question is broken up into 3 parts. However, it will be scored in 4 parts, and I'll show you how they do that. So the first part, identify the year in which Republicans/lean Republicans and Democrats/lean Republicans were closest in their opinions on why people are poor. Second, part B, describe a trend in the graph and draw a conclusion about the possible causes of that trend. And lastly, part C, explain how the attitudes shown in the graph demonstrate differences between Republicans and Democrats in Congress on social policies. So, with FRQ2, usually they're going to give you two parts which are very simple to answer, and then two parts which will require extended knowledge. So you don't really need to know anything except how to read a graph for this question. So for example, part A, identify the year in which Republicans and Democrats were closest in deal. You should see that that is very clearly 2014. That's simply the answer. So, and then for part B, we see the first part, describe a trend on the graph. So you can look at a number of things here to describe looking at that graph. So you could say Republicans are increasing in their beliefs as to why people are rich, why the reasons for poverty. We could talk about how Democrats are trending downwards in those two categories. And also too, you can explain the trend that they're moving further apart. Now, so the things are the way that this will be credited, you would get credit for the first part in part B, and then another point for the second part of part B. And then lastly, part C is basically explaining what you got the answer for in B part 2. So let's take a look at the sample question here. So the response, so what does College Board want you to see? Again, identify or describe the data that they asked you, describe the pattern or trend, and then say why that trend is happening. And then lastly, here for part C, explain how that data actually came to be. So let's take a look at the sample response, which you'll notice is kind of verbose again, because you want to make sure that you are stating everything that you possibly can to make sure that you get the points. So, as we see here in part A, the graph shows how the attitudes of Republicans and those leaning Republican differ from those of a Democrat and those leaning Democratic on reasons people are rich or poor. The two groups were closest in their opinions on why people are poor in 2014, when 29% of Democrats and those leaning Democratic believe people are poor because of a lack of effort on their part, while 47% of Republicans and those leaning Republican held that view. The difference in opinions between the two groups widened after that. So I explained the trend in the data as well. So part B, now let me circle back to part A real quick. The only thing that you would need to do to answer in that point is to say, in 2014 is when they were closest. That is perfectly fine to put for the answer. It's just I went a bit more verbose again to make sure that they understand that I knew what I'm talking about and that they are going to give me the point. All right, looking here now at part B. One trend visible in the data is that the attitudes about the reasons for poverty are moving in opposite directions for the two groups. In 2014, the percentage of Republican and Republican-leaning people who believe people were poor because of a lack of effort on their part was 47%. In 2017, that percentage had risen to 56%. In the same years, the views of Democrats and Democratic-leaning people moved from 29 to 19%. So I've explained the trend in the data, what has happened, that the gap has widened. All right, and now one possible conclusion from this trend is that Americans are becoming more polarized, just as the Congress that represents them is. So I've given the reason as to why there is this possible explanation for the data, why they are changing over time, and I explained that it's merely due to the polarization of the United States during said time. So lastly here, part C. These attitudes demonstrate a difference in how Republicans and Democrats in Congress approach social policy. Republicans are less supportive than Democrats of government-sponsored social programs such as healthcare subsidies, welfare, and food stamps on those people that are poor because they do not exert enough effort. Democrats, on the other hand, believing that poverty results from circumstances beyond people's control, tend to favor programs that help people overcome some of the limitations of their environments and help them out of poverty. So, I've given there the explanation as to why Republican interests believe that and how it relates to social policy as well as Democrats. You need to make sure that you specify all sides here in order to get that. So, all that said, that is FRQs 1 and 2. So, I hope that this has been helpful in me going over this with you guys. Now that this video is done, you guys can go ahead, go on Schoology, and complete the practice FRQ 1 and 2 that I've left for you guys. So, hope that you guys have been doing okay. Come Thursday, it'll be a bit of an easier day, as that day will be just for you guys to go over your key terms. So make sure that all of those are done for Unit 1, and then I will see you in a week. All right, so I'll see you guys next week. Take care and have a good one. Bye, guys.